So another key feature, another one of these fatal 5 factors that brought down Cardinal Wolsey was his background and his personality. As we know, Wolsey was the son of an Ipswich butcher. He came from common stock. He was not of noble blood. Therefore, from the very start, he'd never really fitted in with the other nobles at court, who saw themselves as a different breed. Also, he himself, because he'd risen from nothing to this hugely important and hugely rich individual within Henry's court, he himself was a bit of a show-off. He had a huge house. He had, in today's money, many millions of pounds per year. He was a very flamboyant individual who liked to show off his wealth. This rubbed people up the wrong way. He also enjoyed taking lots of power to himself, we mean by this monopolising power, at the expense of others. So he would be quite happy to take away other people's power and other people's opportunities in order to make himself more powerful and more respected with the king. So his personality had won him lots of enemies within the court, as well as the fact that he himself was a commoner. But there's more specific details we can look at in terms of Wolsey's personality and the sorts of people that he was rubbing up against in the courts. So after Wolsey's failure to have the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon annulled, this left him open to the attacks of all of his enemies at court, all of those noblemen who saw him as a commoner, as an upstart, and who wanted to get rid of him. So after the failure, Henry was given a book containing 30 accusations against Wolsey, accusing him of various different crimes against the king and against the kingdom. At the head of these people who accused him were the Dukes of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk. Really important in the case of the Duke of Norfolk, he was quite possibly Wolsey's biggest enemy, and in fact he was also the uncle of Anne Boleyn. So after the failure to get the marriage annulled, Cardinal Wolsey's personality and his background brings him into conflict with the other nobles who see this as their opportunity to finish him off. He's already in the king's bad books, so now they can finish him off. They pass the king a book with 30 accusations in it. This is led by the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, the Duke of Norfolk being Anne Boleyn's uncle. So you can see the roles of families, of courtiers, and of Wolsey's personality itself in helping to bring him down in the end. Although before we move on, we should remember that despite all of these accusations, despite all of the hatred at court and all of these people trying to move against him, this did not make the fall of Wolsey inevitable. It was not inevitable that Henry would dispense with his favourite chief minister. Other factors had to come into play to finally bring an end to his career. So let's look at the others. So another one of our fatal 5 factors is the Boleyn family, or the Boleyn faction. So the Boleyn family were one of the most important families in Henry VIII's court. It included the Duke of Norfolk, remember, one of the most important noblemen in England at the time. It also included, of course, Anne Boleyn. But there were others associated with the faction, including Anne's sister, Mary, who had also been one of Henry's mistresses. Yeah, the guy got around a little bit. So the Boleyn faction, working in the court, really tried to influence Henry heavily. They also tried to influence other courtiers to come to their faction, to join them, to increase their own power. So the Boleyn faction in court, a very wealthy family, very powerful, very well connected, using their power and their connections to influence Henry VIII and to sway his decisions. And of course, Henry himself was not afraid to reciprocate, to give back. In fact, many members of the Boleyn faction were given titles and lands and so on, and were made very wealthy as a result of their connections to Henry VIII. So it worked both ways. They tried to influence Henry, and he in turn tried to keep them on side by showering them with titles and gifts. So the Boleyn faction was very important in court, and given their animosity, their hatred of Cardinal Wolsey, and their need to get rid of Catherine of Aragon, especially after Wolsey's failure to get the marriage annulled, really brings them into a closer conflict with Wolsey. So what about Anne herself? Obviously one of the chief players in the Boleyn faction, Anne Boleyn. Well, Anne Boleyn had come to see Cardinal Wolsey as one of the obstacles in the way of her marrying Henry VIII and becoming queen. She saw Wolsey as a big obstacle in the way. So she used her influence on the king and the king's love for her to turn the king slowly against Cardinal Wolsey. She clearly blamed him for the failure to get the annulment, and she kept the pressure on. So in October 1529, Wolsey was finally dismissed from his role as Lord Chancellor and stopped being Henry's chief minister. Anne Boleyn probably played a massive role in influencing Henry's decision to do this. And who filled these positions? You guessed it, the Duke of Norfolk. He stepped in and filled the gap where Wolsey had been. It was all working out for the Boleyns. However, even at this stage, it was still not clear that Henry would make any drastic decisions on Wolsey. And in fact, some people at court feared that he might come back and regain his title. Such was his reputation with the king and the king's love for Wolsey. So with Norfolk, now one of the king's chief ministers, and the Duke of Suffolk, the two of them together, they had to work hard, along with Anne Boleyn, to keep influencing the king to stop any chance of Wolsey getting back into power. So the Boleyn faction, along with the Duke of Suffolk, who's joined them, have helped to bring down Cardinal Wolsey, another one of these fatal factors, and they're working hard to keep him out of power just in case Henry changes his mind. So let's look at the final fatal 5 factors. It's Henry's decision itself. What was it that influenced Henry to finally make the decision to put Cardinal Wolsey on trial for treason, a trial which could and probably would have ended in his execution? So it's always important to remember when we're dealing with things like kings and princes that these are people. And even though they might look very different and act very different and have very different lives, they're really just the same as me and you. They make mistakes and they struggle to come up with decisions sometimes. Henry VIII was no different. He struggled to come to a firm decision on what to do with Wolsey. He went from, on the one hand, writing to Wolsey, lending him words of support and encouragement and making Wolsey feel that he still had a way in with the king, to, on the other hand, listening to the advice of the other people at court who were telling him to put him on trial and get rid of him once and for all. But finally, he did make the fatal decision to put Cardinal Wolsey on trial for treason. And what was the reason for this? Well, it all comes down to some letters. Henry VIII was told by a number of people at court, obviously most of those people being Wolsey's enemies, that Wolsey had been writing letters to the King of France, to Charles V, and to the Pope, and that in those letters Wolsey had been saying that he was against the marriage to Anne Boleyn. We don't have any proof that these letters ever existed, but it's this supposed evidence that finally swayed Henry VIII to make the final decision on Wolsey. However, Wolsey's enemies were never to get the satisfaction of seeing their enemy fall from grace under the axeman's blade, because Wolsey died on his way south to face trial and never actually stood trial for these supposed crimes. So these are the 5 fatal factors in a little bit more detail that finally brought down Cardinal Wolsey. The annulment, the failure of his foreign policies, the Boleyn faction, his very own personality and upbringing that won him lots of enemies at court, and finally Henry's decision itself. One thing that you should remember about all of these factors is, even though I've presented them as individual factors, of course they all link together. So your task as historians is, of course, to think about the way in which these different factors link to each other. How can you link, for instance, the foreign policy to the failure to get the annulment? Thanks for watching. Hopefully this has been useful for you, and it will help you in your upcoming exams on Henry VIII and his ministers. Thank you.